The passage of French President Emmanuel Macron's controversial pension reform plan has resulted in widespread protests and strikes across France in recent months. This reform will raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 over the next 10 years. President Macron signed the bill into law on April 15th, with the bill set to take effect in September. Many in France have met pension reform with open hostility and engaged in widespread protests and strikes. Demonstrations began on January 19, 2023, bringing with them extensive travel disruptions and clashes with police. Protests slowly diminished until Macron's controversial use of Article 49.3 to pass the reform package without a vote on March 16th, which exploded into spontaneous large-scale protests in Paris and across the country. Demonstrations in Paris were focused around the Place de la Concorde, where protesters lit fires and clashed with police. Protests in and around Paris continued for the next several days. In April, protesters briefly occupied the investment firm BlackRock's Paris office building and the Euronext stock exchange building. Though Paris has seen the largest number of demonstrations, cities like Lyon and Bordeaux have also been home to large-scale protests, often resulting in clashes with police. Protests against the pension reform plan have continued in the months since, though demonstrations are slowly losing steam. Various unions continued to engage in strikes, resulting in travel and service disruptions, which are especially severe for international travelers. Transportation strikes continue to be one of the greatest threats to travelers posed by anti-pension reform demonstrations. Strikes by pilots and airport and public transportation workers have become increasingly common in recent months. Airport strikes have regularly resulted in the cancellation of 20 to 30% of flights at Charles de Gaulle and Orly international airports in Paris, along with similar delays at other airports. Industrial action by public transportation workers has also led to severe travel disruptions, particularly along rail lines. Past strikes have resulted in the cancellation of over 80% of trains at Paris's primary railway hub, Gare du Nord, along with similar delays nationwide. Buses and other forms of public transportation have suffered similar disruptions. Transportation strikes are particularly severe for international travelers, as they are one of the groups most dependent on air and public transportation to get around while in country. Non-transportation related strikes have also adversely impacted travelers, particularly strikes by sanitation, power, and healthcare workers. These strikes present safety and quality of life issues to travelers, ranging from difficulty accessing emergency healthcare to garbage piling up in the streets. Demonstrations themselves continue to pose notable security threats to travelers and should be avoided when possible. Strikes and demonstrations are expected to continue throughout the summer. Turnout has slowly decreased since March, as has public support for the protesters. Demonstrations will likely peak in September when the reform takes effect, before gradually diminishing throughout early fall. Looking forward, additional demonstrations should be expected in September 2024 to mark the anniversary of the reform and the next retirement age hike. Annual demonstrations against the reform will likely continue for the duration of President Macron's time in office, though none of these demonstrations will be as large or severe as those that occurred earlier this year. Future protests will be more limited in scope and centered around major plazas and roadways, along with government offices and transportation hubs. The Place de la Concorde will likely remain a major focal point for protesters due to the plaza's importance following the invocation of Article 49.3. Associated strikes, particularly by transportation workers, will continue to play a role in demonstrations moving forward, though worker participation will decrease over time. Lingering anger over the pension reform will factor into political unrest during the next French election, and may serve to increase the size and severity of demonstrations. The effects of the French pension reform will be felt in both the short and long term, and continue to pose security threats to international travelers.